Hello and welcome. Please set your volume to a gentle level, just enough to hear my voice. Close your eyes, lie still, let the outside world fade away as we begin to drift slowly into sleep. Tonight, we start with the first story in our Boring History for Sleep series, a calm journey through forgotten pages of the past. Our story is called The Standing Guard of Roman Centurions. Before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe so you can return each night and find more stories to carry you into rest. Now, let us begin. The Roman world was not built only by emperors and senators, nor only by marble monuments that shone in the sun. Much of it rested on the shoulders of ordinary men who stood in silence at their posts. Among them were the Centurions, the guardians of the legion's order, men who were tasked not with grand speeches, but with the steady rhythm of command and discipline. To imagine one of them, it is best to think not of a great general with flowing robes, but of a figure who simply remained at his place, unmoving hour after hour, day after day, until his watch was complete. The centurion's life was not filled with the excitement that storytellers prefer. It was a long sequence of rules repeated, duties observed, and rituals carried out with little variation. He rose early, long before the sun had warmed the stones of the camp. The sounds of soldiers stirring, the smell of bread baking, the distant neigh of horses, all of these were ordinary details, unremarkable and constant. He would check the armor of his men, make sure that their sandals were properly fastened, that their shields were held firmly, and that their formation was precise. It was not glamorous work, but it was work that had to be done, for the Roman army did not run on impulse but on routine. The centurion himself wore no crown, carried no scepter, yet in his hands rested the discipline of 100 men. His staff, a simple vine stick, was both a symbol and a tool. With it, he reminded his soldiers that order was not to be broken, that slowness or carelessness had no place in their ranks. He was not expected to be kind, nor was he praised for cleverness. He was required only to be steady, predictable, and unwavering. The hours of the day passed with little distinction. Morning drills, the measured march of feet striking dust, the echo of commands repeated without passion. Midday came with rations of bread and wine, plain sustenance that neither delighted nor disappointed. In the evening, inspections were carried out again, every helmet and sword examined, not because there was always something wrong, but because habit demanded it. And when night fell, he stood watch, silent, as the campfires dimmed and the stars took their places. His duty was not to tell stories of glory, but to make sure no soldier slipped away from his post, no intruder crossed unnoticed into the safety of the legion's walls. The days blurred into each other, a cycle of sameness that few outside the army ever understood. To the citizens of Rome, the centurion was simply a figure in armor, a guard at the edge of the crowd, a face in the procession. But to his men, he was the weight of order itself. A constant reminder that their service was not about moments of excitement, but about the endless stretch of discipline. Even in battles, when chaos threatened to break lines and fear swelled in the hearts of soldiers, the centurion did not change his expression. He raised his voice, firm and unhurried, calling the men back into formation. He stood with his shield planted and his feet steady, not because he was fearless, but because fear had no use in the structure of Rome's legions. His role was not to inspire by charm, but to anchor by example. And so his story, if we call it a story, is one of stillness more than action, repetition more than change. Imagine him now, under the dim torchlight, armor dull with scratches, eyes scanning the horizon. He does not wait for glory, he does not dream of reward. His only thought is that the line must hold, that the order of the camp must not break, that his men must wake tomorrow to another day of sameness, because sameness was strength. As the centuries passed, many names of centurions faded, forgotten even by the armies they once commanded. Yet their quiet presence endured in the memory of Rome's order, in the knowledge that an empire can only expand if someone is always willing to stand guard. And in the stillness of the night, as the camp grew silent and sleep settled over weary men, the centurion remained, as he always did, at his post. The centurion's day was not measured in great events, but in the small details that never changed. The sound of leather straps being tightened across armor, the scraping of whetstones against dull blades, the creak of wooden gates opening at dawn, All these were the rhythm of his existence. If one were to follow him closely, hour by hour, one would not find excitement but an unbroken pattern of observation, correction, and endurance. At sunrise, he walked the length of the camp, noting whether tents were pitched at the correct angle, whether cooking fires were properly extinguished, whether sentries had maintained their posts without complaint. Nothing about these tasks was remarkable, yet the centurion approached each of them with the same seriousness, for he knew that small lapses led to large disasters. To him, discipline was not merely a word, it was the invisible wall that protected Rome's soldiers when swords and shields were not enough. His men respected him not for charm, but for consistency. They knew that he would speak the same words every morning, issue the same orders every evening, and expect the same standards without variation. Some thought him severe, others thought him unyielding, but none doubted that he could be trusted to remain steady, no matter what storms might gather beyond the walls of their encampment. When a new recruit entered the ranks, uncertain and unsteady, it was the centurion who adjusted his grip on the shield, corrected the angle of his spear, and repeated the drill until it became as natural as breathing. Repetition was his chosen instrument. Day after day, he turned chaos into pattern, inexperience into reliability, and hesitation into habit. For him, the measure of a soldier was not bravery in a single charge, but the ability to perform the same act correctly 100 times without failure. At midday, when the sun rose high and cast long shadows across the camp, the centurion did not retreat into comfort. He remained in the open, eyes scanning the horizon, ears alert for the faintest sound beyond the perimeter. A rustle of leaves, the distant cry of an animal, the faint clink of metal, all of these were to be noted, never ignored. His watchfulness was not fueled by suspicion, but by duty, the unshakable belief that every moment deserved his full attention. Even in stillness, he was at work. Evening brought little change. The soldiers cleaned their gear, adjusted their sandals, and prepared simple meals. The centurion inspected once more, walking among them, saying little but observing much. If a strap was frayed, he pointed it out. If a blade was dull, he ordered it sharpened. If a soldier slouched, he corrected his posture with a firm word or a tap of the vine stick. None of this carried drama, yet all of it formed the quiet architecture of survival. When the night fell and torches flickered, the centurion took his place at the watch. His silhouette, framed by firelight, was as steady as the stone walls of the camp. Hours passed, but he did not pace or fidget. He stood, shield near at hand, gaze fixed outward. Others slept, but he remained awake, as if his presence alone could keep the darkness at bay. He was not a poet nor a philosopher, but in his stillness he expressed a truth that empires depend upon. The truth that vigilance, more than brilliance, holds the line. In time, soldiers rotated, generations of men came and went, yet the figure of the centurion remained unchanged. Whether on the Rhine frontier or in the deserts of the East, his routine did not waver. The scenery altered, but the man's posture stayed the same. Always checking, always correcting, always standing. His reward was not applause or riches, but the knowledge that Rome endured another day because order had not faltered. And as history moved forward, as emperors rose and fell, the memory of battles faded, and monuments crumbled, the image of the centurion persisted, not in marble, but in the echo of his discipline. He was the man who remained when others slept, the one who did not flinch when silence pressed heavy on the camp. He was the quiet thread that bound the legion together, unseen yet essential. And so, as you listen now, drifting gently toward rest, imagine his figure standing motionless beneath the stars, armored not in glory, but in patience, waiting through the endless hours of night, his presence a reminder that the strength of Rome was not only in conquest, but in the ordinary man who stood his ground without fail. To understand the centurion is to understand a rhythm that does not change, a cadence that repeats endlessly without demanding attention. In the early morning, when the camp was still wrapped in mist and silence, he would begin again with the same motions as the day before. He rose before the others, not because he enjoyed the chill of dawn, but because duty did not allow delay. His sandals pressed against the damp earth, his cloak gathered around his shoulders, and his eyes scanned the rows of tents as if they were pages in a book he had already read 1,000 times. Each detail mattered. A tent flap left loose, a shield leaning against a pole at the wrong angle, a soldier's belt not tightened correctly. All were marks of disorder, and disorder was a weakness that could spread quickly. The centurion corrected them with the same steady gestures, neither harsh nor indulgent, simply exact. His men had grown used to this constant attention, and though some grumbled, most found comfort in it. For when the world outside the camp was uncertain, it was the centurion's predictability that created a sense of safety. He did not offer them promises of victory or speeches of inspiration, only the quiet reassurance that order would be preserved as long as he stood watch. Drills filled the hours that followed. The men marched in straight lines across the packed earth, their sandals striking the ground in perfect unison. Commands rang out, sharp and unchanging, each syllable repeated until it lost all flavor and became pure sound. The centurion did not demand brilliance. He demanded sameness. The same step, the same thrust, the same turn of the shield. Over time, this monotony became second nature, and the soldiers moved not because they thought, but because their bodies remembered. To outsiders, it may have seemed dull, yet to the centurion it was proof that discipline had taken root. When the midday sun stood overhead, there was no celebration, no pause for comfort. The rations were as plain as always, bread dense and heavy, wine watered down to last longer, perhaps a handful of dried fruit if supplies allowed. The centurion ate little, his mind still fixed on the routine that bound his day together. His satisfaction came not from taste, but from the knowledge that the army's order remained intact, that every soldier knew his place and every shield was ready to be lifted if danger came. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, he checked equipment once more, moving through the camp with measured steps. He listened to the sharpening of swords, the murmured talk of soldiers, the hum of insects in the heat. These were ordinary sounds, steady and unchanged, and they told him that all was well. Evening came, and with it another round of inspection. The centurion's vine stick tapped against shields, against helmets, against armor straps, not as punishment but as rhythm, a reminder that vigilance never ended. His voice was low but firm, repeating the same words he had spoken the night before and would speak again tomorrow. And when the sky darkened and the stars emerged, he once more took his place at the watch. The hours of night stretched long and uneventful. The campfires dimmed, the voices of men faded into sleep, and the only movement was the flicker of shadows across the earth. The centurion did not allow his body to relax into slumber. He remained upright, eyes steady, hand resting on his shield. Time passed without markers, yet he counted none of it wasted. To him, the stillness of the night was not emptiness but duty fulfilled. If danger never came, it was because vigilance had done its work. If his men slept peacefully, it was because he had chosen not to. This endless cycle, unbroken by glory or comfort, was the life he accepted without question. He was not celebrated, nor remembered by name, but the weight of Rome rested on his constancy. And so the centurion continued, day after day, night after night, a figure of quiet endurance whose story was not of triumphs shouted, but of silence kept. A life measured not in victories, but in the countless moments of standing guard, unseen yet indispensable. The centurion's life was defined not by the exceptional, but by the expected, by the repetition of ordinary duties that became almost indistinguishable from one another. If one were to step into his world and watch closely, the impression would not be of a man chasing moments of glory, but of someone preserving the fragile thread of order through unchanging habits. The morning began again as it always did, with the faint light of dawn creeping across the horizon and the first stirrings of men waking in their tents. Before most had risen, the centurion was already walking the rows, eyes noting the smallest irregularity, hands adjusting straps and ropes, voice issuing the same measured instructions as the day before. He did not seek novelty, for novelty was danger, and in his view, safety lay only in the discipline of sameness. Soldiers who grumbled under their breath found themselves corrected with a single glance, a word, or at times the light tap of the vine stick that symbolized his authority. Yet beneath this surface of severity, there was no malice. The centurion did not raise his voice to be cruel, nor strike to cause harm. He acted as the embodiment of the order that Rome demanded. His presence reminded his men that service was not about what they felt in the moment, but about what was required of them every hour. The The drills stretched endlessly, but that was their purpose. Step after step, thrust after thrust, the soldiers repeated motions until their bodies no longer questioned the commands. And when their muscles ached and sweat darkened their tunics, the centurion's gaze did not soften, for he knew that fatigue was temporary, but habit was lasting. To him, the dullness of repetition was not a weakness, but the very strength of the legion. Noon passed with the same rationed meal as always: plain bread, a measure of wine, sometimes a small portion of meat, but nothing more. The food was not meant to delight, only to sustain, and the centurion ate with the same calm indifference that he brought to every other duty. He was not a man who lingered over taste or sought luxury, for his mind was fixed on the constant rhythm of oversight. He checked the soldiers' gear. He ensured the boundaries of the camp were secure. He looked for signs of wear on the shields and straps. These were small things, but he knew from long experience that the smallest cracks were the ones that grew dangerous if ignored. Evening came with the lowering of the sun, and again he made his rounds. His voice was steady, almost predictable, like the tolling of a bell that never altered its tone. He reminded men of their duties, corrected their posture, and prepared them for the night ahead. When all others settled into rest, it was the centurion who remained awake, posted at the edge of the camp, watching as the darkness spread across the land. The night was long, and silence pressed heavily, broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of unseen animals moving beyond the camp's perimeter. Yet he did not allow his eyes to wander or his thoughts to drift too far. His task was not to dream, but to remain awake, to ensure that the stillness remained undisturbed. Hours passed slowly, but to the centurion, slowness was no burden. It was in the very nature of his work to wait, to stand, to hold steady against the endless passage of time. Many would have found such a life suffocating, but for him it was purpose itself. For every soldier who slept without fear, for every camp that awoke to another day intact, it was the centurion who had made it possible by refusing to waver. History did not record his individual name, but it remembered the shape of his role, the unchanging figure of the man who stood guard when all others rested. And so his story continues, not in a single heroic act, but in the quiet constancy of a life lived in discipline, a life where meaning was found not in change, but in the refusal to change, in the eternal act of standing guard. The figure of the centurion was often seen, but rarely celebrated, and yet without him, the structure of Rome's armies would have collapsed into confusion. His life was not one of constant movement from one battlefield to another, as some might imagine, but rather a patient and careful weaving of routine. Each day resembled the one before it, yet each was lived with the same attention to detail, the same quiet persistence that made the difference between order and chaos. At dawn he rose before the soldiers, fastening his armor with practiced ease, not with pride, but with the knowledge that an example must be set. He walked the camp slowly, scanning the tents, listening to the murmurs of men beginning their day, and making corrections without pause. A rope pulled too loosely, a weapon left unpolished, a pair of sandals worn thin, all of these details were small, but in the mind of the centurion, they were marks of weakness that could spread if left unchecked. He addressed each in turn, never hurried, never distracted. As drills began, his presence was as steady as the rhythm of marching feet. Commands were spoken in the same firm tone, repeated over and over until the sound seemed to blend with the footsteps. He demanded nothing new, nothing creative, only the precise repetition of forms that had been drilled into soldiers for generations. The young recruits, who often grew restless at the monotony, came to understand that this monotony was the shield that kept them alive. The older veterans, whose bodies carried the memory of countless campaigns, did not question him, for they had long ago learned that habit is stronger than courage when fear threatens to scatter men in battle. The sun rose higher, and as shadows grew shorter, the centurion continued his watchful routine. He ate his rations without hurry, never showing preference or complaint. The plain bread, the diluted wine, the dried fruits or salted meats, these were not pleasures but necessities, and he treated them as such. While others might laugh, joke, or seek small diversions, the centurion remained focused, moving from group to group, inspecting shields for cracks, armor for dents, blades for sharpness. His eyes missed little, and his men came to realize that it was simpler to maintain their gear correctly than to face his inevitable corrections. By evening, the camp settled into quiet, but for the Centurion, the work did not end. He made his rounds once again, ensuring that fires were controlled, that sentries were alert, and that the gates were secure. His vine stick tapped against shields and helmets as he checked them, a sound as familiar to his men as the beating of their own hearts. He spoke few words, for his actions carried enough weight. When darkness fell completely, he stood at his watch as always, eyes fixed outward into the vast stillness beyond the camp. He did not pace or fidget, for that would have broken the steady rhythm that defined his life. Instead, he stood unmoving, a figure of patience against the silence of the night. The stars passed overhead, time stretched into long hours, and still he remained, alert to every sound no matter how faint. For him, this was not a sacrifice, but a necessity, the invisible labor that ensured the camp awoke to another day of safety. His men slept soundly because he did not. His own rest was secondary, often brief and light, taken only when he knew another trusted soldier had taken his place. And so the pattern continued, not for days or weeks, but for years. The Centurion aged within this rhythm, his hair touched by gray, his armor bearing new scratches, but his posture remained the same. He was the embodiment of discipline, a man who found meaning not in change, but in constancy. History might overlook his name, yet the empire endured because countless men like him stood firm when all others rested. His was a life of stillness, of vigilance, of duty carried out without end, and though no monument was raised in his honor, the memory of Rome itself was built upon the silent strength of men such as he. In the long history of Rome, the figure of the Centurion became almost timeless, for no matter the century, no matter the province, his role remained the same, and his daily life unfolded with a rhythm that barely shifted from one generation to the next. At dawn he rose, not with urgency but with steady resolve, fastening the same armor, buckling the same straps, and walking the same rows of tents as countless others before him. His eyes scanned for the smallest irregularities, and though most mornings revealed nothing new, he checked nonetheless, for repetition was the essence of his duty. A misplaced shield, a helmet not properly fitted, a rope tied too loosely, all of these he corrected with calm precision. His soldiers did not expect surprise from him, and he offered none. His words were familiar, his tone measured, his actions unchanging, and in that very sameness lay his strength. When drills began, he watched with patience as men lifted their shields in unison, their feet striking the packed earth in rhythm, their spears thrust forward again and again. He did not measure success by enthusiasm or passion, but by uniformity. Every man was expected to move as one body, and if even a single step fell out of time, the Centurion's steady voice corrected it. Young recruits sometimes grew weary, their shoulders aching and their arms trembling, but the Centurion did not relent, for he knew that only through endless repetition could a soldier learn to act without hesitation in the chaos of battle. By midday, the heat pressed down upon the camp, and the men ate their rations quickly, bread dense and plain, wine thinned with water, sometimes accompanied by dried figs or salted meat. The Centurion took the same meal without complaint, sitting briefly but never relaxing fully, his mind already turning to the next inspection. He walked through the camp, listening to the scraping of whetstones, the mutter of conversation, the clink of armor being adjusted. He stopped to examine a shield, to test the edge of a sword, to correct a soldier's stance. These acts were small, almost invisible, yet they formed the framework of survival. When evening came and shadows stretched long, he moved again through the camp, ensuring fires were lit safely, that no tent threatened to collapse, that sentries were ready for the night. His vine stick tapped gently against armor, not in punishment but as a reminder, a rhythm that kept men alert. He said little, for silence was often stronger than words, and his presence alone carried weight. When darkness settled fully, the Centurion took his place at the watch. Torches flickered, stars emerged overhead, and the camp fell into quiet. Around him, men drifted into sleep, their breathing deep and steady, but he remained awake, eyes fixed beyond the camp's boundaries. Hours passed, marked only by the slow movement of constellations across the sky. Yet he did not falter. He stood unmoving, shield within reach, His body trained to endure stillness, he listened to the faintest rustles in the grass, to distant calls carried by the wind, to the silence itself. This was his true work, not glory in the charge, but vigilance in the dark. He knew that most would never think of him, that history would not record his name, but he also knew that Rome endured because men like him kept watch when others could not. The life of the centurion was not one of comfort or reward, but of constancy. Day after day, year after year, he lived within this rhythm, growing older within the sameness, yet never turning from it. And though monuments crumbled and emperors were forgotten, the quiet figure of the centurion persisted in memory, the man who stood guard in silence, who carried the weight of order without praise, whose unchanging duty was the invisible strength that allowed Rome to sleep in peace. The centurion's existence could be described as a long sequence of repeated motions stretched across years, a life that found meaning not in sudden events, but in the enduring weight of duty. When he woke before dawn, there was no hesitation, for he had performed the same ritual countless times. He rose, adjusted his cloak, tightened the straps of his armor, and stepped into the quiet rows of tents that still held the heavy silence of sleeping men. The air was cool, and the mist hung low, and yet none of it altered his purpose. He inspected every detail with patient eyes, noting whether the boundaries of the camp remained intact, whether fires had been properly extinguished, whether the ropes and stakes held firmly in place. Most mornings passed without incident, yet he checked them all the same, for he knew that vigilance was not a matter of reacting to danger, but of preventing disorder before it ever had a chance to grow. His soldiers stirred awake, and under his gaze they prepared themselves, some moving quickly, others slower, but all aware that the centurion would notice if something was amiss. He spoke sparingly, offering not speeches or comfort, but corrections, short and firm, reminders that the smallest lapse in readiness could one day cost lives. When drills began, the routine unfolded as it always had. The men marched in formation, sandals striking the earth in rhythm, shields raised in unison, spears thrust forward and withdrawn. Commands were delivered in a tone that never shifted, each syllable carrying the weight of habit rather than inspiration. To an outsider it might have seemed dull, endless repetition of the same motions, but to the centurion it was the very essence of preparation. He knew that when fear descended in the heat of battle, it was not bravery that held the line, but muscle memory shaped by countless hours of practice. And so he watched with unwavering attention, correcting angles, adjusting stances, and ensuring uniformity, not because he sought perfection, but because sameness itself was strength. The midday meal arrived, simple as ever, bread that filled the stomach without delight, wine watered to last longer, perhaps a slice of salted meat if stores allowed. The centurion ate quietly, never rushing, never indulging, always treating food as necessity rather than comfort. His thoughts remained fixed on the routine ahead, the endless cycle of inspection and correction. He walked through the camp, listening to the scraping of whetstones on blades, to the mutter of soldiers exchanging quiet words, to the dull hum of daily life within the legion. He paused to examine shields for cracks, to test the weight of armor, to ensure helmets were secured tightly. Every act was small, and yet together they formed the invisible barrier that protected the army more than walls or gates could. Evening came, and once again he made his rounds. The lowering sun painted the camp in shades of orange and gold, but the centurion did not linger on the beauty of it. His eyes remained on his men, on the steady order of the camp, on the details that needed his attention. Fires were lit with care, guards assigned to their posts, tents secured against the coming night. He tapped his vine stick against armor, not as punishment, but as rhythm, as if the sound itself reminded the men that discipline did not rest when the day ended. When night finally settled, the centurion took his place at the watch. The camp grew silent, men lay in their tents, and the sounds of sleep filled the air, but he remained upright, gaze fixed on the horizon, posture unchanging as hours crept by. Torches flickered faintly, stars wheeled slowly overhead, and still he stood, the unyielding figure who carried the burden of vigilance so others could rest. He was not remembered by name, not honored by statues, yet his steady presence was the foundation upon which Rome endured. And so, night after night, he continued, standing guard in silence, embodying the quiet strength that defined not only his own life, but the life of the empire itself. The centurion's life was measured less by days and more by cycles that repeated without end, a rotation of duties so familiar that each action seemed to echo the one before it. At first light, he was already awake, fastening his cloak against the chill, tightening the same leather straps that had been tightened countless mornings, and stepping out into the ordered rows of the camp. His boots pressed against the earth with deliberate weight as he moved slowly between the tents, his eyes observing with quiet precision. He noticed the smallest irregularities, a shield leaning at the wrong angle, a stake driven less firmly than it should be, a helmet not resting in its proper place. These were not dramatic discoveries, but for the centurion, they were the details that mattered, for an empire did not survive by ignoring the small things. His men, still shaking off sleep, recognized his presence without needing to be told. Some straightened their posture, others moved a little quicker, all knowing that he would notice lapses before anyone else did. His corrections were brief and firm, never shouted for effect, never softened to spare pride. They were simple statements of fact, delivered with the authority of a man who had lived the same rhythm for years and would continue to live it without wavering. Once drills began, the day settled into its familiar cadence. The centurion's voice rose above the sound of marching feet, calling commands that had been spoken thousands of times before. Shields lifted, spears thrust forward, feet struck the ground in unison, and the dust rose around them in steady clouds. The men performed these actions not because they were inspiring or new, but because they were repeated until they became unbreakable habit. To the centurion, that was the essence of his purpose. Courage might fail, tempers might falter, but routine endured, and in that routine lay the quiet strength of Rome's armies. As the sun climbed high, the camp turned to its midday meal. Bread, wine thinned with water, a handful of dried fruit or salted fish. These were the same rations offered without change, and the centurion took them with the same calm acceptance as he always had. To him, food was neither reward nor comfort, but fuel, no more and no less. His satisfaction came not from flavor, but from the knowledge that order remained unbroken. Afterward, he walked again through the camp, pausing to inspect armor, to test the sharpness of a blade, to note the condition of leather straps. He spoke little, for his presence alone was enough to remind his men that vigilance never rested. Even in the hottest hours of the day, when the sun pressed heavily on shoulders and men longed for shade, the centurion remained steady, his gaze fixed, his movements deliberate. Evening approached, shadows stretched across the camp, and the same cycle repeated. Fires were kindled carefully, sentries were assigned, and tents secured against the night. The centurion's vine stick tapped softly against shields and helmets as he moved among the men, not as punishment but as rhythm. A sound that carried familiarity. A sound that reminded everyone that the discipline of the day carried seamlessly into the discipline of the night. And when darkness finally enveloped the camp, he took his place at the watch once more. Torches flickered weakly against the wide silence, stars appeared slowly in their patient order, and all around him men settled into rest. Yet he remained upright, his figure steady against the stillness, his eyes scanning horizons that rarely offered surprise. Hours crept by, marked not by events, but by their absence, and still he stood. For him, vigilance was not an interruption of life, but the essence of it. This was the quiet duty he had accepted, the role that defined him more than any battle ever could. And so night after night, year after year, the centurion's presence endured, a living reminder that Rome's strength was not only in its victories, but in the countless silent hours kept by men who stood guard when the world around them slept. Through the long seasons of service, the centurion's life unfolded with the same deliberate rhythm, marked not by sudden events, but by the unbroken chain of duties that gave shape to every passing day. At dawn, he rose as always, his body moving through the familiar motions before thought was even required. He adjusted the straps of his armor, tightened the belt at his waist, and stepped out into the morning air that clung cool against the earth. The camp lay in silence, broken only by the faint stirring of men still half asleep. Yet the centurion's eyes moved with steady purpose, scanning the lines of tents, the posts of the perimeter, the details that seemed minor but carried weight in his mind. He found small faults as he always did. A rope tied too loosely, a shield not properly angled against the pole, a a soldier's helmet resting carelessly on the ground, and with each he made the necessary correction. Never in anger, never in haste, but with the calm insistence of a man who understood that discipline was nothing more than attention carried out every hour of every day. His men recognized this quality, and though some resented the constant scrutiny, most accepted it as the invisible wall that kept danger at bay. Once drills began, the familiar cadence of commands and marching feet filled the air. The centurion's voice carried across the ranks, not in fiery speeches, but in the firm repetition of orders, the same words spoken at the same pace, day after day. Shields rose together, spears thrust forward in rhythm, feet struck the earth in perfect unison, and the dust rose with the steady beat of habit. For the centurion, there was no need for novelty, no hunger for invention, for he knew that sameness was the foundation on which the legion stood. To an outsider, it might have seemed tedious, but to him it was proof that his men would hold steady, even when fear and chaos pressed upon them. At midday, the plain rations were consumed without ceremony. Bread dense and filling, wine diluted to last, a portion of dried fruit or salted meat when supplies allowed, all taken without comment, for food was necessity alone. The centurion ate quietly, then resumed his rounds, moving from soldier to soldier, from shield to sword, ensuring that all was in order. He listened to the scraping of whetstones, the clink of armor being adjusted, the subdued conversations that marked the quiet hours, and in each sound he heard confirmation that the camp remained disciplined. Evening approached, the light softened, and once again he made his inspections. Fires were lit carefully, guards took their stations, tents secured for the night, and the centurion's vine stick tapped lightly against helmets and shields, a sound as familiar as the beating of the heart, a sound that carried reassurance as much as command. His men knew that as long as he walked among them, their world remained steady. When night fell and silence descended, the centurion took his post at the watch. The stars unfolded across the sky, torches flickered low, and the camp settled into sleep. Yet he stood as he always had, upright, motionless, gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the darkened walls. The hours stretched slowly, unmarked by event, but he did not falter. Each rustle of grass, each distant sound was noted, weighed, and dismissed. For his duty was not to be surprised, but to remain prepared. He felt neither impatience nor weariness, for to him the long stillness was not empty, but filled with purpose. He was the guardian of silence, the anchor of order, the unseen presence that made rest possible for all others. And so another night passed, like countless before it, and though no record would preserve his name, the empire endured because men like him accepted this endless rhythm, standing guard in the quiet hours when the world slept, and Rome's strength was measured not in conquest, but in constancy. The final picture of the centurion's life is not one of glory, but of continuity, a long unbroken thread that stretched across years and seemed to weave itself into the very fabric of Rome's endurance. As he rose at dawn, the motions came to him as naturally as breathing, the same fastening of armor straps, the same pull of the cloak across his shoulders, the same deliberate steps into the camp that stirred slowly to life. The air carried with it the scent of dust and smoke, the faint sounds of soldiers beginning to wake, and the centurion's eyes moved steadily across the rows, noting the smallest irregularities as he always had. He corrected them patiently, adjusting a misplaced shield, retying a rope, instructing a recruit with quiet firmness. None of it was new, yet none of it was unimportant, for he understood that the empire was not held together by sudden bursts of courage, but by the daily weight of discipline, repeated without fail. His men knew what to expect from him, and in that expectation they found certainty, for the centurion was the one presence in their lives that never shifted with mood or fortune. The drills came again, and with them the rhythmic thud of feet against the earth, the clatter of shields raised in unison, the dust rising in steady clouds. Commands were delivered in the same tone as the day before, and would be delivered in the same tone tomorrow, firm, exact, unchanging. The young grew weary, but endured. The old accepted the monotony as second nature, and through it all the centurion remained unmoved, knowing that it was this repetition, this endless sameness, that turned men into soldiers who could stand firm, even when fear threatened to scatter them. At midday he ate the same rations as always, bread plain and heavy, wine diluted, perhaps a fragment of fruit or or meat when supplies allowed. He asked for no more, desired no luxury, for to him food was only the means by which the body continued its service to duty. The afternoon passed in inspections, in the testing of armor, the examining of straps, the listening to the faint scraping of whetstones across dull blades. He spoke sparingly, and yet his silence carried as much weight as his words, for the men understood that he saw everything, and in his steady presence they found both correction and assurance. Evening came, the sky fading into softer tones, and again he made his rounds. Fires were tended carefully, sentries posted, tents secured, and his vine stick tapped gently against helmets and shields. A sound that had accompanied his men through countless days and nights. A sound that meant discipline held. When darkness deepened and the camp settled into stillness, the Centurion took his place at the watch once more. Torches flickered faintly, stars moved slowly across the vast sky, and silence pressed down like a heavy cloak. Yet he did not falter, his posture upright, his gaze fixed outward, his presence steady against the long passage of hours. He listened to the small sounds of the night, to the rustle of grass, the distant call of unseen creatures, the quiet breathing of men asleep behind the walls, and he stood unmoving, as he always had. He knew his life would not be written in marble, that his name would not be preserved in scrolls, yet he also knew that Rome itself endured, because men like him accepted this burden without question, to stand when others slept, to guard when others dreamed, to preserve order not through speeches or monuments, but through constancy. That was the essence of his existence. And so, as the years passed, and one day became another, the Centurion's figure remained, unchanged, unyielding, the silent guardian whose story was not told in victories, but in the quiet strength of never leaving his post. The story you have just heard has now come to an end. Before we move on to the next one, please take a moment to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more quiet journeys into the past. And now, let us continue with another tale in our Boring History for Sleep series. Tonight, we arrive at our next story, the dull logistics of Alexander's army. The campaigns of Alexander the Great are often remembered for their speed, their daring, and their unexpected triumphs. Yet behind every dramatic tale of victory lay an endless weight of routine that made those victories possible. His soldiers, spread out across vast distances, could not have marched without the quiet machinery of supply that carried them forward step by step, day by day. To imagine this world is not to see only banners waving in the sun or cavalry charging across plains, but to observe the slow procession of wagons creaking under their loads, the dust of thousands of sandals rising into the air, and the steady figures of men tasked with ensuring that food, water, and equipment reached their proper place. Each morning, long before the glamour of battle was even a thought, the logistics officers rose to account for what was needed. They counted sacks of grain, jars of wine, bundles of dried meat, and amphorae of water. They measured how far the next well lay, how many rivers must be crossed, and how many days the soldiers could endure before supplies had to be replenished. These calculations were made without excitement, repeated endlessly with the same patient care, for the success of Alexander's army depended less on sudden brilliance and more on the dull certainty that bread would be available at the next camp. The animals that carried these burdens, oxen, mules, and horses, required their own share of grain and grass, and so fodder too was measured and stored. The sound of hooves, the creaking of leather harnesses, the calls of drivers urging beasts forward, all of these formed the background of the march, steady and unchanging. Soldiers moved beside them, their gear clinking softly, their sandals pressing deep into the soil, and the endless line stretched further than the eye could see. Progress was slow, and though historians later told of great charges and swift campaigns, those who walked remembered instead the weight of monotony, the endless horizon, and the certainty that each day would mirror the last. Fires were kindled at evening, not for celebration, but for necessity, to cook the same meals of grain porridge, flat bread, and watered wine. The men sat in silence, chewing slowly, their thoughts fixed not on glory, but on the simple satisfaction that their hunger had been answered for another day. Officers checked lists, counted supplies once more, and planned the next stage of the journey with quiet precision. If a wagon wheel cracked, it had to be repaired. If a mule collapsed, it had to be replaced. If a river ran dry, the army had to adjust its path. These were not matters of strategy in the grand sense, but of survival in the immediate, and they demanded constant attention. Night fell, and guards were set at the supply wagons as carefully as at the edges of camp, for without food there could be no fighting, without water, no marching, without order, no empire. And so the army slept, its dreams filled less with visions of conquest than with the weary relief of another day endured. The logistics continued, silent and unseen. The framework that supported Alexander's ambition. The quiet force that allowed his soldiers to move ever deeper into lands unknown. And as the stars turned overhead, the dull machinery of supply stood ready to begin again with the next dawn. For in truth it was not only battles that won an empire, but the unending patience of those who managed the simple, necessary work of keeping thousands of men alive one day longer. The march of Alexander's army was less a story of constant conquest than of endless organization, for behind every maneuver of cavalry and every clash of spears lay the patient efforts of those who managed supplies. Each day began before dawn, not with the blare of trumpets, but with the quiet counting of rations. Officers and scribes walked among the wagons, noting how many sacks of barley remained, how many amphorae of water could still be sealed, and whether the lines of mules were fit to continue. Fires smoldered low as soldiers ate their simple meals, bread baked hastily from flour, carried in rough sacks, sometimes a thin stew of lentils, if time allowed, often accompanied by nothing more than water drawn from wells that had been tested carefully for safety. Once the army set out, the march itself unfolded in slow procession. At the front, scouts moved steadily, marking paths and seeking the next source of water. Behind them came columns of infantry, their sandals raising clouds of dust that settled on armor and cloaks, and alongside them the endless train of carts and wagons, pulled by beasts whose tired steps echoed the weariness of men. The creak of wooden wheels was as constant as the beat of marching feet, and though it carried no glory, it was this sound that marked the true rhythm of Alexander's campaign. Officers kept lists on wax tablets, tallying supplies with each halt, erasing and rewriting numbers as food was distributed and water measured out. A cracked jar was noted, a broken wheel repaired, a sick mule replaced, all without fanfare, but with the quiet understanding that failure in these small things would bring disaster long before battle ever did. The soldiers themselves rarely spoke of strategy, but often of rations, wondering when fresh bread might replace the stale, when new meat might be salted and stored, when the next well would appear along their path. They joked in weary tones about the porridge that appeared again and again, yet beneath their words was the recognition that as long as the porridge was there, their strength would hold. At midday, when the sun stood high and the heat pressed down upon their backs, the army halted briefly, allowing animals to drink from barrels and men to rest in the shade of wagons. There was no celebration in these pauses, only necessity, and soon the march resumed, the line stretching onward across plains and valleys, rivers crossed with care, bridges built from rough timber by engineers who worked quietly at the edges of the army. Evening brought its own duties. Fires were lit, rations distributed, weapons inspected, but just as important was the tallying of what remained. How many sacks had been consumed, how many jars emptied, how much fodder remained for the beasts. These figures determined not only tomorrow's march, but the survival of the army itself. And so they were checked again and again. Night descended slowly, and guards were placed not only around the soldiers, but around the supply wagons, for within those stores lay the true lifeblood of the army. Without them, the men could not fight. Without them, Alexander's vision would falter, and so their protection was treated with the same seriousness as any battlefield post. The stars turned silently overhead. Men slept in ordered rows, and the camp settled into a hush, broken only by the distant braying of mules or the creak of leather harnesses in the dark. And so the logistics of the army continued, dull to some, invisible to many, yet essential to all, the quiet foundation on which the great campaigns rested, the endless cycle of counting, carrying, and rationing that gave Alexander the means to chase ambition across continents. When historians later described Alexander's campaigns, they spoke of battles and victories, yet the men who marched with him remembered more vividly the endless details of supply, the slow machinery that kept them moving across unfamiliar lands. Each morning began in much the same way, with the officers of logistics stepping carefully among rows of wagons, inspecting the contents of sacks and jars, scratching numbers into wax tablets, and muttering calculations that determined how far the army could march before thirst or hunger demanded a halt. Soldiers stirred awake, rubbing eyes heavy with dust, chewing on coarse bread baked the day before, drinking water that was often warm and tinged with the taste of the jars that carried it. There was no luxury in these meals, only necessity, yet they were taken with the steady understanding that the rhythm of rations was what gave them strength to march. Once the army began to move, the great column stretched farther than the eye could see. At the head rode Alexander and his generals, but behind them trudged thousands of infantry, and woven among them the slow and vital lifeline of carts, pack animals, and wagons. The creak of wooden wheels was constant, the shouts of drivers urging on weary beasts repeated endlessly, and the dust of the march clung to armor, cloaks, and hair. The pace was slow, not because the men could not move faster, but because the wagons determined the speed of the army, and without the wagons, no victory could be sustained. Scouts rode ahead to locate water, engineers marked paths for crossing rivers, and scribes marked down each portion of food distributed along the way. The monotony was broken only by small troubles: a mule collapsing from exhaustion, a wheel splitting against a stone, a jar cracking and spilling grain into the dirt. These were not dramatic moments, yet they mattered deeply, for each loss meant a recalculation, a shifting of rations, an adjustment to the pace. At midday, the men halted briefly, resting in the shadow of wagons or trees, while animals were watered and soldiers consumed another portion of grain or dried meat. The heat pressed heavily, and the stillness of these pauses was filled with the sound of chewing, the braying of animals, and the creak of leather straps being adjusted. Soon the march resumed, and the endless line stretched again across the horizon, step after step, hour after hour. Evening brought the familiar cycle of setting camp. Fires were lit with wood gathered hastily. Soldiers sat in small groups, eating porridge stirred from grain supplies, speaking little as weariness overtook them. Officers checked lists once more, counting sacks, measuring what remained, recording losses, and preparing for the next day. Sentries were placed carefully around both the men and the supplies, for without the wagons, the army was nothing more than a body with no nourishment. The night air grew cooler, stars bright above, and the camp settled into silence, broken only by the soft crackle of fires and the shifting of beasts in their harnesses. For the centurions and supply officers, sleep was light and brief, for the work of logistics did not rest with the setting of the sun. Even in dreams, the soldiers thought of bread, of water, of when and where the next meal would arrive. And so the campaign continued, not only through battles remembered, but through these slow, unseen hours, where the real measure of endurance was found in the patience to march, to carry, to count, and to repeat, day after day, without glory, but with absolute necessity. The slow machinery of Alexander's march revealed itself most clearly in the countless routines that repeated with such predictability that the soldiers began to measure time, not by battles, but by the weight of daily tasks. At first light, the supply officers were already awake, bending over wax tablets, calculating the distance to the next settlement, the number of animals still fit to pull their loads, the jars of water that remained sealed, and the portions of barley that could be stretched across another day. The soldiers awoke to the same sound of leather creaking as they tightened their belts, to the same smell of fires kindled quickly, with whatever wood could be found, to the same coarse bread baked from flour, carried in rough sacks slung across weary mules. There was little variety and less comfort, yet the men accepted it because they knew that without the careful predictability of supply, their strength would collapse long before they reached the field of battle. Once the camp was struck, the army began its long march, a slow line stretching across the landscape like a river of men, animals, and carts. The scouts rode ahead, searching for water and marking paths through valleys and plains. Behind them came the infantry, their sandals striking the earth in steady rhythm, their armor dulled by dust, their faces shaded by the long hours of the sun. Alongside and behind them rolled the supply wagons, creaking under the weight of grain, wine, and equipment. Drivers shouted at mules, whips cracked, wheels groaned, and the pace of the entire army fell into the measured step of the slowest cart. Each small mishap demanded attention. A broken wheel meant halting the line until it was repaired. A mule that faltered had to be replaced, or its load shifted among others. Every loss, no matter how small, required recalculating rations, rewriting tallies, and adjusting expectations for the days ahead. The men understood this even if they grumbled, for they had learned that battles were won only when the supply line held. Midday halts offered little relief. Soldiers sat in the narrow shade of wagons or rocks, chewing on dried meat, drinking from skins that carried water warm from the sun, while animals were led to troughs or streams if they could be found. There was no celebration, only the quiet necessity of rest before the march resumed. The heat pressed down, dust clung to every surface, and the soldiers moved again with resigned patience, step after step, hour after hour, the endless column stretching toward an unseen horizon. When evening came, the cycle repeated itself in reverse. Wagons were drawn into a ring, tents raised in ordered rows, fires lit with care, and the rations distributed once more. Grain was boiled into porridge, bread baked in simple flat cakes, and wine poured in measured amounts. The soldiers ate slowly, speaking in low voices, their weariness evident in every movement. Officers checked their lists again, noting what had been consumed, what remained, and what would be needed for tomorrow's march. Guards were set, not only around the perimeter but specifically near the wagons, for those carried the true lifeblood of the army. Without them, no order could be maintained, no campaign continued. Night deepened, stars appeared, and the camp sank into the quiet rhythm of sleep, broken only by the distant bray of mules or the soft crackle of firewood. The men rested, but the burden of vigilance remained with those who counted and planned, who knew that the next day would unfold with the same demands, the same calculations, the same dull but essential work. And so the campaign advanced, not only through daring charges and decisive victories, but through the unseen monotony of logistics, the endless cycle of carrying, rationing, repairing, and marching that kept Alexander's vision alive. The long journey of Alexander's army was in truth carried not on the brilliance of sudden maneuvers, but on the steady weight of daily organization, for each mile conquered required not only courage, but also the endless repetition of counting, carrying, and preparing. Each morning the sun found the officers already awake, bent over their wax tablets, recording the number of sacks that remained, the jars sealed tight with pitch, the loads strapped across the backs of animals whose patience was tested as much as the soldiers. The men awoke to the same routines, fastening their sandals, shaking the dust from their cloaks, chewing dry bread while the fires smoldered low. There was no indulgence in these meals, no celebration of flavor, only the quiet reassurance that sustenance had been provided for another day. Once the signal came, the camp broke apart in slow precision, wagons rolling forward, drivers urging animals into line, scouts already moving toward the horizon in search of streams or wells. The great column advanced as it always did, measured not by the speed of the strongest horse, but by the slow pull of wagons, the creaking of wood, the steady shuffle of feet. Dust rose in clouds that clung to armor and hair. The heat pressed down as the day lengthened, and the sound of the march was as monotonous as it was necessary. Soldiers spoke little, for their voices carried little over the endless rhythm of movement. Yet in their silence they carried an unspoken understanding that their survival rested on the dull procession of carts filled with grain and water. Small misfortunes marked the hours. A mule stumbled, its load shifted awkwardly until men corrected it. A wheel cracked, and carpenters set to work with hammers and wedges while the line slowed to a halt. A jar of oil broke, seeping into the dirt, its loss recorded on the tally that evening. None of these incidents was dramatic, yet together they shaped the reality of the campaign more than any clash of spears. At midday, the men rested briefly, eating from rations drawn carefully from the stores, chewing on dried figs or salted meat, drinking water that grew warmer with every hour. Animals were watered, harnesses tightened, wheels checked again, and before long, the march resumed, the horizon shifting slowly but steadily. Evening brought a reversal of the morning's order. The wagons were drawn inward, the camp laid out in rows, fires kindled with whatever brushwood could be gathered. Soldiers sat in groups, their bowls filled with porridge stirred from the same grain that had been measured at dawn, their cups filled with wine thinned to last the journey. Officers counted once more, marking figures onto tablets, subtracting what had been consumed, calculating how far the remaining stores might carry them. The soldiers murmured softly, some joking about the sameness of the food, others silent with fatigue, all aware that the machinery of supply mattered as much as the bravery of any charge. Guards were posted, not only at the edge of the camp, but around the wagons themselves, for those wooden carts represented the survival of every man present. Night settled slowly, the stars wheeling overhead, the fires burning low, and still the supply officers thought of tomorrow's march, of how many rations remained, of how far to the next river. The soldiers slept on the hard earth, their breaths even, their dreams dull, while the animals shifted restlessly in their harnesses. And so another day ended, indistinguishable from the last, yet essential to the campaign's survival. For it was not glory alone that carried Alexander across continents, but the quiet endurance of logistics, the dull but necessary labor that repeated without fail, sustaining the army one weary day at a time. The endless march of Alexander's army carried forward not only on courage, but on the slow and constant routines of logistics, routines that repeated with such familiarity that each day seemed a mirror of the one before. At dawn, the officers of supply rose before the rest, moving among the wagons with tablets in hand, counting sacks of barley, jars sealed with pitch, bundles of dried meat stacked beneath cloth covers, an amphorae of water carefully marked for rationing. They recorded what was taken and what remained, their wax tablets filled with rows of numbers of basas, erased and rewritten as distribution was carried out. Soldiers woke in ordered rows, chewing bread coarse and dry, sometimes softened with a little wine, sometimes accompanied by figs when stores allowed, but most often plain and unchanging. Fires burned low, smoke curling into the pale light of morning, and soon the call was given to strike camp. Tents collapsed, wagons creaked into line, animals tugged against their harnesses, and the column began its slow advance. The sound was always the same, the shuffle of sandals against dirt, the groan of wheels carrying their burdens, the calls of drivers urging on beasts that grew weary with each mile. Scouts rode ahead, searching for water and marking paths across plains or valleys, while engineers followed with tools to repair bridges or cut roads. Progress was slow, for the pace of the army was set not by the swiftest cavalry, but by the slowest wagon, and the men knew that no matter how far they wished to march, their steps would be measured by the creaking rhythm of supply. The hours passed with little variation. Dust clung to armor, sweat gathered beneath cloaks, and the sun pressed heavily on their shoulders. Yet still the army moved forward, for to stop was to risk hunger, and hunger was the one enemy that could not be defeated by strategy alone. At midday the column halted, soldiers sitting in the thin shade of carts or rocks, chewing again on the same rations distributed with care. Animals drank from troughs filled bucket by bucket. Harnesses were checked, wheels inspected, and lists updated. Then the march resumed, steady and deliberate, until the horizon shifted into the fading light of evening. Camp was set with practiced efficiency. Wagons drew inward, tents rose in rows, fires kindled from whatever brushwood could be gathered. Soldiers sat quietly, bowls filled with porridge stirred from measured grain, wine poured sparingly into clay cups. Their conversations were muted, their laughter subdued, for weariness pressed more heavily than excitement. Officers counted supplies again, marking what had been consumed, calculating how many days remained before fresh stores were required. Each cracked jar or broken sack was noted, for in the careful arithmetic of survival, nothing could be ignored. Guards were posted not only along the perimeter, but around the wagons, their spears glinting in the firelight. For those carts carried the true strength of the army. Without them, no soldier could march another day, no conquest could be imagined. Night deepened, stars moved slowly overhead, and the camp settled into silence broken only by the braying of mules and the occasional clink of metal. The soldiers slept, their bodies stretched across the hard earth, while the officers of supply thought ahead to the next morning, to the same counts, the same tallies, the same unchanging routine. And so another day closed, not with glory, but with the dull persistence of logistics, the quiet labor that carried Alexander's vision further than any speech or sword could. The story of Alexander's campaigns was often told in terms of swift victories and daring advances, yet beneath every triumph lay the quiet and unending work of supply. For without the dull weight of logistics, the army could not have taken a single step. At dawn, the same routine unfolded as it always had. Officers moving among the rows of wagons, checking seals on amphorae, weighing sacks of grain, measuring out fodder for the animals, and scratching tallies onto wax tablets with practiced precision. Soldiers rose to the familiar smell of smoke and ash, tearing pieces of bread that had been baked the night before, chewing slowly in silence while the camp stirred into motion. Drivers harnessed mules and oxen, carpenters tested the strength of wheels and axles, and scouts set out ahead to locate water and forage. Once the signal was given, the camp dissolved into movement, a column stretching out across the landscape, its rhythm marked not by drums, but by the creaking of carts and the steady press of thousands of sandals against the earth. Dust rose into the morning air, cloaks and armor dulled by the constant march, voices carrying in low tones that spoke not of glory, but of weariness. The pace was dictated by the slowest wagon, for without the wagons the soldiers could not eat, drink, or march another day. And so the army moved as one body bound to the dull but necessary machinery of supply. Midday brought only a pause, the line halting as animals drank from barrels or troughs hastily filled, men sitting in the meager shade of wagons to chew once more on dried meat or porridge stirred from grain rations. There was little change from day to day, and yet this sameness was what held the army together, for hunger and thirst were enemies that required constant vigilance. When the march resumed, the sounds of the column returned as if they had never stopped. The thud of feet, the groan of wheels, the shouts of drivers, and the braying of animals. Small mishaps marked the hours, a wheel splitting against a stone, a mule stumbling under its load, a jar breaking and spilling grain into the dirt. But these were addressed with practiced calm, carpenters repairing, soldiers shifting loads, officers adjusting tallies. Evening drew near, and once again the camp was set in ordered rows, wagons drawn inward, tents raised quickly, fires kindled from gathered wood. Soldiers sat in groups, bowls filled with the same grain boiled into porridge, cups filled with diluted wine, voices subdued with fatigue. Officers walked the camp counting once more, marking how much had been consumed, how much remained, and how many days before new stores must be sought. Guards were posted not only along the edges but near the wagons, for in them lay the true lifeblood of the army. As darkness deepened and stars wheeled overhead, the camp sank into silence, broken only by the restless shifting of animals and the low crackle of fires. The soldiers slept on hard ground, their bodies worn, their dreams filled not with visions of conquest, but with the dull comfort of routine. And still the officers of supply remained awake a little longer, thinking of the next march, of the next count, of the next ration to be measured and distributed. Thus the campaign moved forward, not only through bold maneuvers remembered in history, but through the monotonous persistence of logistics, the quiet repetition that sustained Alexander's men one day at a time, across endless miles of foreign land. The image of Alexander leading his army across distant lands often inspires thoughts of swift conquest. But the reality that sustained such marches was slower, heavier, and filled with repetition. For the true movement of the campaign was carried on the backs of wagons and the patience of men who lived by the rhythm of logistics. At dawn, the cycle began again as officers moved deliberately among the supplies, counting sacks of barley stacked carefully, ensuring that amphorae of wine and water were still sealed, checking whether bundles of fodder for animals had diminished more quickly than expected. Soldiers rose quietly, stretching limbs stiff from sleep on the hard ground, and broke their fast with bread dry and coarse, sometimes softened in watered wine, sometimes nothing more than grain boiled into porridge. Fires smoldered as mules and oxen were harnessed once more, their braying carrying across the camp, while carpenters tightened wheels and drivers secured loads with rope. Soon the long column unfurled across the land, moving with the same deliberate slowness as always, a line that wound like a great snake across plains and valleys. The sounds were constant, the groan of wood under strain, the shuffle of thousands of sandals pressing dust into the air, the commands of officers shouted without passion, The low talk of soldiers spoken in tired tones. Scouts rode ahead, searching for water and forage, while engineers trailed close, ready to cut paths through dense ground or repair bridges that strained under the weight of wagons. Midday arrived with little fanfare, a pause in the march that offered no more than shade where it could be found, a mouthful of dried meat, another swallow of water from skins that grew warmer under the sun. Animals were given their share, buckets filled and lifted, and then the column creaked forward once more, the horizon shifting slowly as the hours dragged by. Small troubles marked the march, a beast collapsing under its burden, a wheel splitting on a stone, a jar breaking and spilling its contents into the earth, each recorded carefully by officers who adjusted tallies and recalculated how long the stores might last. When evening came, the camp was raised in practiced rhythm, wagons drawn inward to form a ring, tents erected in straight lines, fires lit with the same dull efficiency, soldiers gathered in groups, bowls filled with porridge from the same grain, wine diluted and poured sparingly, voices hushed by fatigue. Officers walked quietly among them, recording numbers, checking lists, speaking in low tones as they accounted for every loss, every portion consumed. Guards were posted in 2 rings, one along the perimeter, one around the wagons, for it was well known that the supplies were the heart of the army's survival. The stars moved overhead in their slow and patient arcs. The fires sank to embers, and the camp grew silent except for the shifting of beasts and the occasional murmur of men in sleep. The officers of supply lay down at last, but even in rest, their minds carried the weight of numbers, thinking of what would be required tomorrow, of how far to the next river, of how many meals remained before the stores must be replenished. Thus the march continued, not with sudden brilliance, but with the dull constancy of logistics. The endless repetition that gave Alexander the means to push farther across continents. His victories carried not only on the edge of swords, but on the slow wheels of wagons and the patience of men who endured monotony as faithfully as they endured battle. The quiet strength of Alexander's conquests lay not only in the courage of his soldiers or the brilliance of his strategies, but in the heavy, unchanging rhythm of logistics that accompanied every step of the march. For no matter how far the army advanced, it was always tethered to the slow creak of wagons and the measured count of supplies. At dawn, the routine began again. Officers bent over wax tablets, noting numbers that seemed never to end, tallying grain sacks stacked in ordered rows, marking the jars of oil that remained sealed, calculating how many days the stores might last if rations were stretched thin. Soldiers awoke beside smoldering fires, tearing coarse bread that filled the stomach without pleasure, swallowing watered wine, or dipping bread into bowls of porridge made from the same barley that had sustained them yesterday and would sustain them tomorrow. Mules and oxen groaned as harnesses were tightened, wheels tested by carpenters, ropes pulled taut to secure loads that would shift over miles of uneven ground. Once the order to march was given, the camp dissolved into a column that stretched across the land, the sound of thousands of sandals striking dirt rising into the morning air, the groan of wooden wheels carrying their burdens forward in rhythm with the braying of animals. Scouts rode far ahead to seek the next well or stream, while engineers followed with axes and hammers to cut paths and strengthen bridges. The soldiers moved with patience, their armor coated in dust, their faces lined with fatigue, speaking little as the hours dragged on. Midday brought a pause but not relief, only another portion of dried meat or figs, another swallow of water from skins that grew warm under the sun, another chance for animals to drink from troughs filled hastily. Small troubles marked the march as they always did. A mule faltering and collapsing, a wheel cracking on a stone, a jar slipping and spilling grain into the earth, each loss noted carefully by officers who adjusted figures and recalculated what remained. The soldiers watched silently, knowing that each detail mattered, for without food and water the army would falter long before battle was ever joined. Evening came slowly, and with it the setting of camp repeated with the same precision. Wagons were drawn into a ring, tents raised in straight rows, fires kindled from gathered wood. Soldiers sat wearily, bowls filled with grain boiled into porridge, cups filled with diluted wine, their voices subdued, their bodies heavy with exhaustion. Officers walked among them again, checking stores, marking losses, whispering calculations to one another as the tally of the day was brought to completion. Guards were set around the camp and around the wagons, for it was well known that the supplies were the true lifeblood of the army. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, torches flickered, fires burned low, and the camp settled into silence broken only by the restless shifting of animals in their harnesses. The men slept in ordered rows, their dreams quiet, while the officers of supply thought ahead to the next dawn, to the same counts and the same measures that defined their days. And so the campaign advanced not with sudden leaps of brilliance alone, but with the dull constancy of logistics, the endless repetition of tally and ration, the quiet work that made possible the grandeur of Alexander's ambition, though it passed unseen by those who later told only of victories and battles. The final image of Alexander's campaigns, though often told in stories of battles and triumphs, can also be seen in the slow, patient endurance of logistics, for it was not only the clash of armies that carried him across continents, but the unbroken chain of supply that followed every step of the march. At dawn, the same motions unfolded as they always had. Officers rising before the soldiers, bending over their wax tablets, recording how many sacks of grain remained, how many jars of oil had been consumed, how much fodder must be given to the mules and oxen before they could be harnessed once more. Soldiers stirred slowly from sleep, stretching stiff limbs, breaking pieces of coarse bread, dipping them into bowls of barley porridge, swallowing watered wine that offered no pleasure but carried necessity. Fires smoldered, smoke drifted low, and soon the camp dissolved into motion as tents were struck, wagons loaded, animals tethered and urged forward. The column stretched into the distance, moving with the same steady rhythm that had carried it day after day, its sound not of trumpets or cheers, but of wooden wheels groaning under weight, of sandals pressing into dry earth, of drivers calling to beasts that bent their heads beneath the burden. Scouts rode ahead searching for water, engineers followed ready to repair bridges or cut paths, and the army advanced not in glory, but in dust and monotony. Midday came with little change, a pause in the march long enough for animals to drink and men to chew another portion of dried meat or figs, for water to be swallowed warm from leather skins, for harnesses to be tightened again. The sun pressed heavily, dust clung to armor and cloaks, yet the column moved on with the same resignation, each man aware that survival depended not on daring, but on the measured patience of logistics. Small mishaps came as always, a wheel cracking, a mule faltering, a jar breaking and spilling its contents into the dirt, each noted by officers who adjusted their tallies and recalculated how many days the supplies would last. Evening brought the familiar reversal, the wagons drawn into a circle, tents raised in rows, fires kindled, rations measured and distributed. Soldiers sat quietly in small groups, eating porridge from bowls, drinking wine thinned with water, their voices low, their movements heavy. Officers walked slowly among them, tallying once more, whispering figures, adjusting lists for the next day's march. Guards were posted carefully not only at the edges of the camp, but around the wagons, for every man knew that within those stores lay the true heart of the army. The stars turned slowly overhead, the fires sank to embers, and the camp sank into silence broken only by the braying of mules and the shifting of restless animals in the night. The soldiers slept, their bodies worn, their dreams dulled by routine, while the officers of supply thought once more of the coming dawn, of the same counts to be made, the same rations to be measured, the same endless cycle to be endured. And so the campaign advanced across foreign lands, not by brilliance alone, but by the steady patience of logistics, by the dull repetition that gave Alexander the means to pursue his vision. Though history would tell of battles and conquests, the reality lived by his men was one of dust, of carts, of rations counted and consumed, of nights guarded and days measured, the quiet endurance that allowed empire to rise, not through glory alone, but through the silent persistence of supply. Before we close tonight's story, here is a gentle reminder. Try not to go to bed on a heavy stomach, and give yourself time to breathe away from the bright glow of your phone. The quiet you allow yourself now will help your body rest more deeply. Release the day's tension and let your thoughts settle like dust at the bottom of a calm river. Thank you for choosing to spend this moment with us. Sleep well, and may tomorrow bring you peace and ease. We'll meet again in our next story, here at Sleep Whisper.